Hello again, guys. It is I-Free700. We are back with some Kingdom Under Fire lore. This time, what the fuck is Azilla? Now, Azilla is one of the three human nations that we know of. The fun thing about them, though, is that they are really only in one video game series, and then after that, they never seem to regain their power. So this is going to be a very interesting lore indeed. So, strap yourselves in, and here we go. Now, you may be thinking, like, what is Azilla at all? Like, you may not be familiar with them at all. So what is it exactly? Well, it's a human kingdom that was discovered by Keither, a legendary knight from the very first War of Heroes. After the first War of Heroes, he settled down with a few settlers and discovered a delta formation along a river, and this delta formation being known as the Azilla Delta, he named the town Azilla. Now, the settlers are from Hiranidin being another human nation at the time. But the location of Azilla was smack dab in between both nations, Ecclesia and Hiranidin. So it received aid from both nations as the settlement grew. And over time, it became its own thing. It had its own customs, rulers, its own military. So it became independent. This is, of course, within the span of like 100 years. Pretty short time, honestly, for it to develop into this huge nation. Now, what makes Azilla interesting, in my opinion, is that it contains a court and a king. Now, the king can do pretty much anything, it seems. Like, he can declare war, he can declare crusades. He doesn't really need the backing of the court. But he does need the court's respect, and he does need at least some of the court to follow along with him if he wants to keep the peace, as the people who are in the court are other lords who hold their own castles and armies. Obviously, the king would have the best of both aspects. He would have the best castle and the best armies, but it helps a lot more when you have other armies joining with your forces. Now, the way that works, though, is kind of tricky, but the king can march off with his army, and he can say, you know what, I'm going to go help Ecclesia fight off some demons, and there's that. And everyone in the court could deny and say, no, we're not going to fucking help. There's nothing stopping the king from still doing it, though, and then coming back. There's no sort of mutiny or anything that can happen there. The only thing that can happen, though, is that if the courts really don't like the king and they don't like what he's doing, individual lords can decide to break away from Azilla, declaring their castle and their troops are their own, in which case they're an independent faction, or join another faction like Hiranidin or Ecclesia. Usually when this happens, though, this leaves the king in a weaker position, and it tends to make the court more disorganized, as now they're going to question openly whether they should just leave as well or overthrow the current king and appoint their own successor. Now, what does keep the court in check, though, so that way it's not constant overthrowings, is that the people of Azilla determine who their king is, as King Gurno was not very liked by the court, and he had no heir, so when he died, the throne was empty. Now, none of the court could assume the role of the king because the local people didn't back up any particular one of those lords, but they did back up the General Curian, and because they backed him up for his famous deeds, fighting evil, fighting the Dark Legion, they wanted him to be the new king. And the court allowed it. They had no choice. The people have decided they want this guy to be their new king. Now, what is interesting, though, about the court is that although Azilla is of Hiranidin descent, they do come from Hiranidin. Hiranidin holds no influence in the court of Azilla. The only people who hold influence in Azilla's politics is Ecclesia, which is very interesting indeed. The reason why Azilla holds an influence there is because Azillans are very religious, deeply religious, very, very strict to their word of God. Ecclesia is the church. They're the church nation. So therefore, their religion comes from Ecclesia. Due to this, the king priest of Azilla holds a lot of influence in the courts. He may tell them one thing, and the courts will have to respect it and say, okay, we will factor that in our next decision. Like, hey, should we allow dwarves to live in our city? They will have to adhere somewhat to what Ecclesia is saying. This is very interesting, as I've said before. Because you would think Hieronodon, since they come from Hieronodon, but no, it's actually Ecclesia. Now that we've talked a bit about what Azilla is, so now you understand the way their politics work and the way that they are pretty much governing themselves, you may be wondering, well, now what's Azilla's military like? Well, the military is actually pretty interesting. It's basically knights, well-armed soldiers, dwarves, elves, mages, even artillery. Basically, what it is it's going to be super small, but super elite. This is the way it is mostly in A War of Heroes, and even in Kingdom Under Fire 2, we see that they pretty much still follow the same path of extremely well-trained men, extremely well-armored, but their armies are just kind of tiny. This would, of course, make sense from a lore perspective. After all, they are the newest of all the three human nations, so it would make sense that they have the smallest population. But it's also more interesting is that they uphold this code of chivalry and honor. So when it comes to their army, they don't want to do something like Hieronodon does, where everyone's just pretty much a common man, common woman who's a farmer. Just give him a weapon and just hope to God he can hold out. No, they can have a little bit more leeway than that because they're farther away from the front lines. Again, Hieronodon is right there on the Dark Legion's front line. So they can't really afford to train this guy for 10 years, teach him what it's like to be a knight. They can't really afford that. They just need a guy here and now, hold the line with as many people as possible. But they're not like Ecclesia either, where Ecclesia is so far away from the conflict that they can just field this large army, and every individual soldier is well-armed, well-trained. They have a lot of paladins, mortars, stuff like that. They're not that rich either, so they can't really do Ecclesias. So instead, they go somewhere in the middle. They have a small army, but it's super, super elite. We see this a few times in A War of Heroes. We even see this in Kingdom Under Fire 2, where we'll see Hieronodon's having a hard time. They're fighting tooth and nail, as they always do. And then all of a sudden, here comes like 500 knights. And these knights, yeah, it's only 500 of them versus tens of thousands of orcs. But those 500 knights are so strong, so tough, that they will mow down all the orcs, and they'll mow down the orcs' base as well. This is something that Azilla is more akin to. The whole goal of their army is to be true to God, to be honorable, upholding their codes of chivalry. But at the same time, they are not like Ecclesia. They're more like Hieronodon, where they have no problem changing their tactics, relying on elves and dwarves to get a victory. If they have to send a mage to just do a kamikaze spell and just wipe out all of the orcs, they will do that. Ecclesia, on the other hand, is more hands-on. They're more of, we're going to send an elite army that's very big, and they will crush the opposition, and then we're going to hold on to stuff, and we're going to say, fuck you, elves and dwarves, we'll kill you too if you come close to us, because you're against our religion. Azilla is not that blinded by their faith. They're deeply religious, but they're not that deeply religious to the point that they're going to look a gift horse in the mouth. So that's the one nice thing about Azilla. Now let's talk about all of Azilla's history in the world of Kingdom Under Fire, because I don't plan on making a second video on this. It's best if we just get it all out there. Let's talk about everything about Azilla. Now, one of the funny things is that during the early years of Azilla, the court was corrupt and the kings were typically weak. That was until King Gurno came, and he instilled something more than just a symbolic figurehead, but instead he was a real king, a real powerful figure. And then King Curian followed up with that lead. Now, a fun thing about it, though, is that King Gernot was deeply into fighting the Dark Legion and using the strength of Azilla's armies to protect humanity, specifically Hieronodon. This, of course, was against the court's wishes, as they were more focused on their own power and gains, seeing helping Hieronodon as a loss of power, and Ecclesia was influencing them to stay out of the fighting and to continue profiting from their current corruption. King Gurno obviously didn't like this, and him being a very strong ruler, he ignored his court and defended Hieronodon anyways, and then came back to see the people were clamoring his name, worshipping that they finally have a fucking king that's powerful enough. This, of course, only pissed off the court, as they viewed it as foolish and a waste of manpower to aid Hieronodon. After all, Hieronodon is still independent. Azilla didn't take them over or anything like that. One of the most influential members of the court, and the one with the most ties to Ecclesia, would be Lord Demetric, and his son, William Demetric. they both decide to leave the court, declaring their Castle Clenderleaf. God, that's very hard to pronounce. Clenderleaf. And his armies independent of Azilla. This, of course, pissed off King Gernot. King Gernot decided now is a good time to show just how strong of a leader he is, and to teach the rest of the court of how a king deals with deserters. He sends Curian, before he's a king, he was just Curian, as an emissary to Castle Clenderleaf. Now, mind you, Curian is a very strong young knight at this time. He's easily able to beat scores of knights all by himself. Now, while emissary Curian is there in Castle Clenderleaf, King Gernot decides to assemble a massive siege on the castle of Clenderleaf. Now, Curian pretty much had no idea this was going to happen. He thought he was truly just an emissary just to deliver a few diplomatic discussions and hopefully resolve this issue. Well, all of a sudden, Demetric gets pissed seeing the army right outside his window and says, Curian's an assassin, kill him. Now, in the lore, no matter what the player does at this point, in a War of Heroes, you could choose to just not kill Demetric and just escape the castle. But in the lore, what it's stated is that King Demetric does get killed by Curian. But Curian only does this as a way to escape because he kills all of his attackers and Demetric in the process in order to escape Castle Clenderleaf and reunite with Azilla's main forces and King Gernot. Now, King Gernot appreciates this. He appreciates that Curian killed Demetric for him. But, despite all this, Curian is very betrayed deep down inside by his friend King Gernot. Because after all, this was a very scummy tactic and Curian does not want to be a part of that ever again. Now, what happens next, though, is very fucking crazy. Because the Dark Legion attack the castle as well, turning the battle into this massive three-way fight where King Gernot and Curian are holding off against Clenderleaf and Hexter forces at the same time. This was a crazy battle. Now, the fun thing is that King Gernot actually wins. He wins, but it was a fuckfest. Now, upon returning to Azilla, the court is more pissed, but this time they're not going to do any drastic measures. They understand that this current king is not to be trifled with. King Gernot is not somebody that they want to voice their displeasure of, as much as they're pretty pissed about the fact they just lost even more soldiers for little to no gain. Now, Azilla is pretty weakened from this point on because the siege of Castle Clenderleaf went so terribly. But King Gernot views this as an opportunity to request aid from the elves and dwarves, despite even further resentment from the court, because the court is saying how much Ecclesia wouldn't like a relationship to be established with the dwarves and elves. After all, the Ecclesia's own king priest declares that Azilla will not work with the non-converted. The non-converted are the dwarves and elves. So if King Gernot goes through with this, a lot of his court is going to be in a very weird position because they like the influence they're getting from Ecclesia, but Ecclesia is going to be like, what are we bribing you guys for if you guys are just letting the king do this shit? This is against our religion. This is extremely against our politics. Here he is aiding Hieronydon despite us telling you not to. Here he is attacking anyone who tries to join us. Here he is signing up with non-converted races. This is total heresy in their point of view. Now, despite this, King Gernot goes ahead anyways and sends Curian to go ahead as an envoy, this time not as an assassin, to go ahead and secure a relationship with the elves and dwarves. This works, but by the time Curian succeeds and returns to Azilla, an Ecclesian spy is seen assassinating King Gernot. This puts Azilla in an uproar and total fucking chaos ensures, where the court is in total disarray. They're trying to figure out who's going to be king, but anyone they think of, the people will not support. Also, the Dark Legion are still pressing on. They're building the altar of destruction. They're getting ready to destroy the world. So, Curian, now becoming the leader of all of Azilla's forces, decides we need to deal with the Dark Legion first before we deal with Ecclesia. This is a very smart move from the young man. Because most people would be a little too hot-headed and they would just say, fuck the Dark Legion, let the world get destroyed. I'm going to get payback. But Curian's a little bit more level-headed. After maybe, I would say, a month or two of dealing with the Dark Legion, Curian returns to Azilla, but is now crowned King Curian. As the love of his people was with him in the courts, no matter what they said, had to follow through with his crowning of kingship. Now, upon being throned as king, Curian sent many diplomatic messages to Ecclesia. All of them failed because Ecclesia didn't want to accept, or at least try to accept that, hey, we did assassinate the previous king. But the reason why Curian's doing this is because the people are still demanding blood for King Gurno's assassination. So, with all diplomacy failed, Curian sent a final ultimatum. Bring the assassin of King Gurno to us, or suffer the consequences. Ecclesia is still going, well, we didn't really pay an assassin to King Gurno. It just so happened to benefit us. Like, we have no idea who that assassin is. Come on. King Curian says, cut the bullshit, we're going to war. This war with Ecclesia was massive. Very, very massive. What happened was all the forts and fortresses that are in the Godland, Ecclesia, were absolutely destroyed. But the destruction of those forts was very difficult for Curian because what happened is son William Demetric, the son of Lord Demetric, is now being backed by Ecclesia and their massive army of Storm Riders, Knights Templar, and, you know, they're sitting on the defense side. They have the home advantage. They have all these forts lying around. And it turns out what Ecclesia is going to do is they're going to kill King Curian and his small retinue of mages and warriors and knights. And then they're going to put William Demetric as the new king of Azilla and force Azilla to follow that king because he's going to have the whole backing of Ecclesia. Curian is pissed because William Demetric is a traitor, and Demetric even admits that he's the one who paid for the assassin, he's the one who went through with it. So, with this massive battle of this large Ecclesian well-armed forces and Storm Riders versus King Curian's small elite army of archers, warriors, mages, Curian actually succeeds. He destroys every fort, kills William Demetric as a final payback for being a traitor, and, more importantly, he destroys all of Ecclesia's armies. Now, the thing about this that's really crazy is that while King Curian's going on this crusade, the Dark Legion once again rise. And this time, they decide to attack Hronodin hard. They almost wipe out Hronodin. So by the time Hronodin envoys come back to King Curian and ask for aid, Curian realizes, oh shit, I can't fight a war on two fronts. So he offers Ecclesia a truce. The truce is, Ecclesia has to be in a military alliance with Azilla, or Ecclesia will be razed to the ground. Realistically, Curian wasn't going to actually raze Ecclesia to the ground, but Curian definitely wanted Ecclesia to not be at war with him. Ecclesia gratefully accepted the offer. After all, survival is a very strong motivator. So from there on out, Azilla charges back into the Second War of Heroes and continues fighting the Dark Legion. But by the time the Second War of Heroes was over, Azilla was exhausted. The war having just astronomical losses for Azilla. Azilla did most of the fighting after all. Ecclesia really didn't even help. Hronodin was on the brink of destruction like 3 times. Ecclesia sees an opportunity. See, after the War of Heroes, King Curian has now entered the Dark Dimension. And the courts were now in more chaos as, again, nobody in the court had the people's backing to become king. The people are exhausted. They have seen so much warfare and so much bloodshed, they don't want to fight anymore. So with the whole country unsure of what to do, Ecclesia steps in again. But this time, they permanently step in. What they do is they use their influence in their military forces to subjugate Azilla into a vassal. Now their kingdom has a king that more or less is a symbol rather than an actual king. Their forces and labor are directly going to Ecclesia now. Azilla, no longer having its own army or courts, it would forever be this way. Where now what you would have is any Ecclesian soldiers is a 50-50 whether or not they're actually Ecclesian or Azillan. Then there's also the fact that one of their generals, General Kendall, the leader of the Crusading army during the events of the Crusaders, was Azillan. So this is what happens from here on out for the next few hundred years, is Ecclesia stays in control of Azilla, and Hieronyddin stays pretty much independent. They still help Azilla out because they feel like they owe the same king, King Curian, but they will not help Ecclesia. There has been some issues with Ecclesia when it comes to Hieronyddin's history. That would be a separate video on its own. So during the events of Kingdom Under Fire Crusaders, Ecclesia is on a constant war with the Dark Legion, sending many knights and paladins that were of Ecclesian and Azillan blood into Hexter to reclaim the Holy Land. But when Ankh-Blosa War started, Ecclesia lost a lot. They lost their patriarch, they lost most of their forces. Their patriarchal guard was wiped out, which is their most elite army. They lost their crusading army, it was fucking wiped out. So in order to survive, after all, Ecclesia is in the forefront, the front lines for once, of a significant war with a bunch of demons. So the only way Ecclesia could survive is by having Hieronyddin's help. Because after all, Azilla doesn't have really its own army, and they're still dealing with their own political strife. Because the people still want to be independent, but the issue is that they don't know how. It's been so long since they've been independent, they're not sure how to do it. And they're not sure how to break away from Ecclesia, because after all, they do share a lot of similarities with Ecclesia. They're very deeply religious. So to break away from Ecclesia is to break away from your church. This is a very deep issue for Azilla. And during the Ankh-Blosa War, fighting demons and shit, they're really not sure what to do. So what happens is Hieronyddin defends Ecclesia while the heroes Kendall, Dwayne, Lionheart, and Rainier charge in to stop Ankh-Blosa from destroying the Age of Light. Now, once the heroes succeed, Ecclesia has more or less survived the ordeal. Honestly, they were so badly wounded that Hieronyddin by this point said, wow, you guys have literally nothing left standing. We'll just take over from here. And that's exactly what Hieronyddin did. They took over Ecclesia and Azilla at the same time, because Azilla is Ecclesian property. Now, over the years, by the time Kingdom Under Fire 2 happens, Azilla does have its own army again, but it's still under Hieronyddin rule. But hey, at least Azilla is a nation again. That's great. They have their own king. Nothing is said about their courts, so we don't know if they do have a court anymore, but we do know they have their own army, they have their own walls, their own city, and they have their own king, but they're still under rulership of Hieronyddin's king. Now, by the time Kingdom Under Fire 2 starts, where you start playing the game, the city of Azilla gets destroyed. Absolutely fucking destroyed. By Ankh-Blosan forces. Demons. As they kill the king of Azilla and take relics that would help bring about the Age of Darkness, the rest of Azilla is left in a bit of a weird spot. Because see, the city Azilla is totally razed and will never again be a nation. But the Azillan people are still left alive. So, where do they go? Most of them fled to Greyhampton, and a few other Hieronyddin settlements. And it's from there where Azillan mercenaries are still one of the best mercenaries you can find, but the issue is that they're a dying breed as Azilla is now permanently destroyed. We do not know if there ever will be a new Azilla. After all, Kingdom Under Fire 2 is still kind of in development, but when you play it now, all of Azilla's people have no home. They have no nation to cling to. Their city is totally destroyed. So now they're living amongst Hieronyddin. This, of course, means that Azilla is no longer a thing at all, which kind of sucks for me because, honestly, Azilla was so important in the first game, but then in the next games afterwards, they are just not a thing anymore. They just don't even fucking matter. So if anything, what we can learn from Azilla's history is that such deep warfare definitely critically wounded their nation. The only nation so far in all of Kingdom Under Fire's history that survived this kind of warfare was Hiranudin. Hiranudin has almost been destroyed like 4 times. 3 times in just one war alone. But yet they always are strong. They always come back. And that's because they don't attain to things like elite trained troops, well indoctrinated men. They don't believe in all that shit. They just believe in their own countrymen relying on one another, fighting with your own brothers in arms. Grab whatever pitchforks you got, whatever sword you have, and just swing away for the king. Azilla and Ecclesia do not adhere to that. They adhere to more knowledge troops who wear better gear, but in doing so, that is, of course, going to cause a lot of attrition throughout the wars as the wars progress. So, Azilla, that's pretty much all we got on them. That's all their history, their army, what makes them unique, their politics. And with that, I'm going to have to say, see you guys next time. It's been your boy, Frieza700, and as always, comment down below what you guys liked most about their lore. Maybe you guys like the way they fight, maybe you guys like how unique their culture is. Besides that, see you next time.